Good afternoon, everyone. It's a lovely, warm, and just absolutely pleasant Friday afternoon here in Southeast New Brunswick. I'm welcoming you to session 2 of your anxiety toolkit. We've been talking about anxiety a lot recently, and this is part 2 of 3 sessions, building a toolkit around understanding anxiety and some coping strategies to mitigate the effects of anxiety. So we're just going to get started in a moment. We're going to wait for everyone to join us. We'll give it a moment, but just for way of reminder and introduction, my name is Kerri. I'm sometimes called the Coffee and Conversation Counselor. I believe that the best conversations start over a hot cup of coffee. I have a private practice in Riverview, New Brunswick, and I love partnering with the Canadian Mental Health Association to provide programs such as this and others when we are meeting face-to-face. So, happy Friday. Some big changes here in New Brunswick as the loosening of restrictions moves into the yellow phase of our recovery plan here in New Brunswick. So some exciting news out of the capital this morning, I guess afternoon now. So last week we identified what anxiety is. We owned that it is an absolutely normal and natural human response and that it can at times be very helpful. We identified that when anxiety becomes an interference or causes difficulty in your everyday life, that's when it is problematic. I gave you a little bit of homework, practicing your 4-7-8 breathing. And I apologize, my seasonal allergies are out of control. So the technique was to inhale for 4 through the nose, hold for 7, and exhale for 8. So that was your homework, was to practice that while you washed your hands. Your other homework was to practice the stop technique. This is a 4-part practice to arrest and reconsider anxious thoughts. The first step was stop, picture a stop sign, or say the word stop out loud. Step 2, T, take a breath. The 4-7-8 breathing is ideal. O, observe. What are you actually feeling or thinking in that moment? What would a person who is removed from the situation observe? And this 4th step, P, proceed with a proportional plan, something that is reasonable to the events. So that was last week's homework. So today we're going to be talking, excuse me, we're going to be talking about automatic thoughts and unhelpful cognitions. Well, jeepers, what the heck do I mean by that? Well, see if I can get this going here. Does this look like a lot of exhaustion, this image, right? This is a mind map, and for those of us who have done some work this way, mind maps are a great way to come up with ideas. Whenever we experience any kind of emotion, that emotion is always accompanied by a set of thoughts, right? So these thoughts are constructed by the words or statements that manifest sometimes in the forms of questions in our brain. And with anxiety, we know that it's often the what if questions. We ask these questions in order to kind of make sense of the emotions we're experiencing and of the circumstances in which we find ourselves. If we ask the right kinds of questions, we get the kinds of answers that help us move forward in a positive way. However, in the anxious brain, we tend to ask the wrong questions, and we often end up creating bigger and more problems for ourselves. So this is where we're going to jump into the unhelpful thinking styles. We're going to talk about 10 specific unhelpful thinking styles that can impact us and cause us a lot of difficulty. This is, in some ways a very oversimplified explanation of our thought process. It's how we think and how we respond to circumstances. When we choose to think in optimal ways, we get the best out of things. However, when we go into the anxious thinking, those limiting ways of thinking, we can make the situation far worse than it actually is or that it needs to be. So we have both helpful and unhelpful thoughts, right? That makes sense. We have, two sides of the coin. When we experience the unhelpful thoughts, these really often manifest from unhelpful emotions, such as anger, such as stress, depression, etc. When we experience that unhelpful emotion, preceded by a series of unhelpful thoughts or statements that we make to ourselves, then we understand that this is an unhelpful thinking style or an unhelpful pattern of thinking. And these are really built on automatic, habitual patterns that we've picked up over our lives, right? It's a lifetime of building this pattern. And these thinking styles are really problematic when we consider that they ultimately direct the behavior that we experience or that we manifest at a really unconscious level of our awareness. So if we're in the habit of using really unhelpful thinking styles on a consistent basis, we can be assured that we're not living life to our fullest potential. Because these thoughts are not helpful, they're not making our lives any easier. They're certainly not empowering us in any way. And when we consider that these unhelpful styles that we've chosen to use and chosen to adopt are limiting our opportunities, creating additional problems, and making us feel absolutely miserable, I suspect that maybe we want to put an end to them. So let's have a look at the 10 unhelpful thinking styles that typically characterize anxious living. So number 1, I'm going to find my mouse here. Mental filtering. Mental filtering is ultimately the process of filtering information in and out of conscious awareness. As this is happening, we tend to focus only on very specific things while ignoring everything else. So this often involves filtering out the positives, right? And only bringing into conscious awareness all of the negatives of the situation. So as a result, we tend to focus excessively on problems and on the negative events and on their consequences. Alternatively, or on the flip side, we also tend to ignore the positives or opportunities with which we're presented. So for example, we might be in the habit of focusing on small, insignificant details of an event or situation. These details might tend to be negative in nature, but they're insignificant. So focusing on them really doesn't make any sense, but we do it anyway for some reason, right? And we focus on them because we need to gain some value or benefit from complaining or pointing out the negatives. We've given the wrong kind of attention to them. And when we're so caught up in thinking this way, we don't even consider other possibilities that might be more favorable or more positive. And as a result, we feel miserable. We just don't feel good. Mental filtering also can occur when we reflect on past experiences. We might, for instance, have all kinds of wonderful memories of past events and circumstances, but at the moment, we may not be in a healthy state of mind. And as a result, only tend to recall the painful or negative, hurtful experiences from the past. And quite honestly, this is how a person who is living with depression may think. This is the negative cycle of thinking that can happen. Likewise, when we feel disappointed or angry or hurt, or we're living with low self-esteem, this is also an indicator of mental filtering. I'm just going to pause because I see there's a question. Practice the breathing technique and was getting lightheaded. Am I doing something wrong? Possibly you're not ready for that extended. So it doesn't have to be 4 seconds, 7 seconds, 8 seconds. You could just do 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and ultimately build up to the 4 seconds, 7 seconds, 8 seconds. If you haven't been doing this kind of breathing in the past, it may be challenging and you may experience lightheadedness. If you do experience lightheadedness doing the breathing technique, stop. All right, I'm just going to close that chat box so I can see my notes here on the screen. So that's mental filtering. So let's move on to the next little piece about mental filtering. I'm going to sneeze, pardon me. And I'm not going to sneeze. When we experience mental filtering, we need to think about having some exploratory questions. So if we pause for a moment and think about our thoughts, consider how we tend to use our mental filters. When we do this, I want you to really think about asking yourself some specific questions. When do I tend to use that negative filter? Are there specific situations in which I use it? How am I thinking at that time? What's happening here? Why do I think this way? What does this say? What do I say to myself in this situation? Why do I tend to filter things this way? Do I gain something from it? Your key objective at this point is to get a clear understanding of how you tend to use your mental filters throughout your life. And awareness is ultimately the first step to change, right? So to overcome this particularly unhelpful thinking style, we want to look for the silver lining in every situation. Make an effort to find more positives than negatives. Focus on the positives, and we will be able to successfully shift how we think about the situation. Now, it's not just a matter of, oh, let me think positively, then I'll be positive. But there is a little bit of that in there. So, for example, instead of asking these questions and challenging yourself, ask, am I seeing the full picture here? Is there something missing? How would other people see this? Remember the stop technique, observing from a distance? How would other people interpret this? What would they say is the silver lining? What do I say is the silver lining? What is the positive about this that I haven't noticed? And how do the positives outweigh the negatives here? And why is it so important to view this situation in a positive light? So it's really important that we do, kind of challenge ourselves with these exploratory questions so that we're not caught up in that negative cycle, right? That we're not constantly in that place of, oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no. So that's our first unhelpful thinking style, the mental filtering. Our second one is called jumping to conclusions. I know a lot of us have done this. I know a lot of us do this on the regular. So this is a cognitive distortion where we tend to make irrational or unreasonable assumptions about circumstances or about people. So for example, we assume that something will happen in the future. This is what we call predictive thinking, or assume that we know what someone else is thinking, mind reading. The problem with this is that conclusions, these particular kinds of conclusions, are rarely, if ever, based on facts or concrete evidence, but they're rather based on our feelings or opinions. So as a result of this, they can often lead us astray. And in order to successfully work through this kind of cognitive distortion, we need to question whether other explanations or possibilities exist. Right? And we can get really fixed in this mindset of, I know what the other person is thinking. I know what's going to happen. So jumping to conclusions mean that we are assuming that something is going to be a certain way, or that people will respond a certain way without having the necessary evidence to back up our assumptions. Now, this is not the same as having an inkling and intuition about something. That's very different. This is about prematurely judging something. It's prematurely judging before you have enough information to necessarily support your conclusion, right? There's no backup. So this can be particularly unhelpful if we're making negative conclusions about the people that we're interacting with, about particular situations in our lives. So we may, for example, make negative assumptions about what might happen if we make a particular decision, buy a house, go on a date, et cetera, et cetera. And these assumptions can potentially direct our mind away from opportunities that we could have taken advantage of, opportunities for growth, for forward movement, but we're stuck in these assumptions in jumping to these conclusions. And so misreading situations, misreading people in this way can really cause unnecessary friction in our relationships and cause us unnecessary harm. So we tend to jump to conclusions in two specific ways. I mentioned them both, mind reading and predictive thinking. So I just want to take a second and look at those a little bit. I get this mouse going. So mind reading. So let's talk about mind reading. So what is it? Like, I'm not talking about, the crystal ball or, the mentalist that we see on television and so on. This is really about assuming that we know what someone else is thinking, or assuming that we know the rationale for their behavior. For example, my husband sends me a text and says, I really want to chat when you get home tonight. If I'm engaged in mind reading as a part of jumping to conclusions, my alarm bells start ringing. I quickly jump to conclusions about what this might mean. Oh my gosh, we're going to have a disagreement. There's something bad. Are they, have they cheated on me? Are we going to break up? Have they lost their job? All kinds of negative assumptions happen. Or perhaps, you're chatting with a person who is constantly moving. They're shuffling their feet, they're shifting, they're move, 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 move. Your assumption, the conclusion that you jump to, is that they're not interested in speaking with you. Maybe they find you boring. Maybe they don't want to engage with you. However, if we do a little digging, we may come to realize that perhaps that person has been standing on their feet all day and is a little restless or needs to move. Or perhaps they have ADHD and they find it difficult to sit still, right? But because we've made this mind reading jump, we assume what we simply can't know. Jumping to these kinds of conclusions just isn't helpful. We're stressing about things unnecessarily by doing this. Now, having said that, these kinds of conclusions do provide us with important insights into our own insecurities. So, if you jump to the conclusion that your partner's cheating on you because they send you a text saying we need to talk, that tells you something about what you fear, about what you worry about. Or if you think that the other person's not interested in having a conversation with you because they're moving a lot, that speaks to what you're afraid of how other people perceive you. You perhaps perceive yourself as being boring or uninteresting. So it's very important to recognize our own insecurities in the kinds of assumptions that we make. When we use these filters to try to make sense of other people's behaviors, it is not helpful. It will cause us a lot of absolutely unnecessary anguish. And I use that word because it is mental anguish when we experience that. So what about the second part of jumping to conclusions? Well, that's predictive thinking. This is when we're making predictions about something negative that will happen sometime in the future. We're putting so much weight on the negatives of the situation that we end up experiencing a lot of unnecessary stress and anxiety. For example, you might need to do a presentation for an upcoming corporate function. Maybe it's a Zoom presentation like this one. And maybe this is the first time you're doing a presentation of this nature. As a result, you're starting to feel, uncertain, a little nervous. You start jumping to conclusions about all the things that will go wrong. The camera won't work. The internet connection will drop. Nobody's going to pay attention. Your technology will fail. The slides won't work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So despite the fact that you're probably a very competent presenter and that you know your subject matter, or else you wouldn't be asked to do it, you start thinking about all these things that will go wrong. And then you start to feel really terrible. And this puts a lot of extra pressure to perform on you. So that predictive thinking is ultimately a very negative coping style, or thinking style, pardon me, and doesn't serve you or help you in any way, shape, or form. So when we engage in this predictive thinking, in this mind reading as part of jumping to conclusions, again, just like with our mental filter, we want to do some exploratory questions. So how do I tend to jump to conclusions? Ask yourself, because there will be a pattern of how we do this. When do I indulge in predictive thinking? In what circumstances do I do this? Around what kind of specific situations do I jump to conclusions? What evidence or facts do I tend to overlook? Because there's going to be certain kinds of things that we have blinders onto, right? How am I thinking at that time? Why do I think this way? What do I say to myself? What's that inner conversation, that inner dialogue? And how does this make me feel? Ask yourself, why do I tend to jump to conclusions? What is it? Do I gain value from it? And again, the key objective is not to necessarily change it in the moment, but to get an understanding of how we tend to jump to conclusions. Again, awareness is that first step to change. So to overcome the habit of mind reading, it's important that we first let go. We first let go of needing to win the approval of other people. I love when we hear someone say, it's none of my business what other people think of me, right? Letting go of the need to win the approval of other people. You're not going to be able to please every single human. It's just not the way it is. Some people are going to like you, some people won't. That's life. We need to accept that. On the flip side, if we expect the best intentions from people, unless we have solid evidence to prove otherwise, then we are better able to keep an open mind. right? And we can be receptive to new ideas. We can be receptive to new perspectives. And that puts us in a really great frame of mind for moving forward again. So ask ourselves, how do I know this is true? Where's the concrete evidence, right? How can I test my thoughts about this? Or what if things really aren't as they seem on the surface? You know, we know the old saying, don't judge a book by its cover. So what if there's more to it than what I think? What if there's more to it than just shifting and shuffling? What if things are the way I imagine them? Why should this bother me? Am I less of a person as a result of this other person's behavior or opinion? These are really important questions to ask yourself as you're exploring through predictive thinking and mind reading. Always question the predictions you're making. How do I know this will turn out this way? What evidence do I have? You hear a pattern here? Starting to see a pattern? What's the evidence against this? How do I handle this if it actually is true? What's the best, the worst, and the most likely outcome? So these are really great ways to kind of challenge those thoughts and reframe our thinking. Next up, personalization. So we're all adults. I shouldn't assume that. I'm assuming we're all adults watching this. We're all autonomous humans. We all have the freedom to make choices. Part of that is we choose sometimes to consistently take the blame for absolutely everything that goes wrong in our life. Probably not accurate, right? Whenever anything doesn't work out as expected, we tend to immediately take the blame if this is one of our unhelpful thinking styles. We assume, jump into conclusions, we take the blame for things whether or not we are actually responsible for the outcome. You know, the sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. And not that, gee, I'm sorry that happened to you, but more of a, I'm sorry, golly, I must have caused this in some way. So taking responsibility for our life and circumstances is, you know, obviously an admirable quality, but it can end up being completely burdensome if it becomes a habit that leads to feelings of regret and guilt. And again, in order to successfully work through this particular cognitive distortion, we need to question what part we actually played in the outcome and how we might not be entirely to blame. Again, we're going to get into some exploratory questions. We're looking for the evidence. What is there to support the notion that we were to blame? Excuse me. When we look at personalization, it's important to note that it's a form of self-inflicted guilt, right? It leads to feelings of shame, feelings of inadequacy. It's when something unfortunate happens to us that we tend to blame ourselves for. So we invite one of our friends out for a socially distanced hiking trip. Okay, we're going to do the Dobson Trail. And during that hike, they fall, sprain their ankle, and you now blame yourself for inviting them. What? You know, it's that thing. Well, they would never have gotten hurt if I hadn't invited them along. Or let's say you go to the grocery store and you buy some milk that's past its use-by date, you know, before it's best before. Instead of returning it, you blame yourself for not checking the date on the bottle or on the box. Okay, really? Or maybe your son or daughter is playing a sport for school or recreationally, and they make a real blunder and it costs the team the game. You end up blaming yourself for not coaching them better, when in fact they made a choice too because they're autonomous. And this isn't really about taking responsibility, it's about taking the entire blame for things that are not entirely our fault. And there's a massive difference there, and I really hope you can seize on to the difference between appropriate responsibility and inappropriate blame. You know, sometimes it's about taking blame for things that are outside of our control, whether the grocery store put expired milk on the shelf or didn't remove the expired milk from the shelf. Taking responsibility for every single negative thing that isn't fully within our control is a completely self-defeating behavior, right? It's just going to bring us down and bring us down and bring us down. Yes, on the one hand, you're taking responsibility, which, as I mentioned, is like totally admirable quality. But on the other, you're ignoring very important factors of who else was involved, or what else was involved, or what was completely outside of the locus of your control. As a result, that whole blaming yourself for absolutely everything that went wrong or could go wrong is going to completely damage and deflate your self-esteem, and you will begin to feel discouraged, miserable, unworthy. Yes, be responsible for your life. Yes, be responsible for the many roles you play. Yes, be responsible for your thoughts, your choices, your decisions. However, at the same time, keep in mind that not everything is your fault or your responsibility. You are not to blame for all of the negative things in your life. You are not to blame for other people's failures or mistakes. Sometimes things are simply outside of your control. We must accept that and live with it. There are things I simply cannot control. Breathe. I don't like it, but I accept it. Life is not always puppies and unicorns, right? Negative things do happen. Sometimes bad things happen, and sometimes things will be our fault. It's true, right? Sometimes it will. However, there's times when absolutely nothing or no one is to blame. It's just how things are. We take what is, and we make the best of every situation. I just had the Facts of Life theme song run through my head. I don't know why. I'm dating myself by telling you that. And then we move on. We move on from there, right? Again, ask yourself those exploratory questions. How much of this problem am I actually responsible for? What is the specific cause of the problem? How could I go about solving this problem? What were the intentions of the people involved, right? What were the actual intentions of the people involved? To what extent was this outcome due to causes completely outside of everyone's control? And what if there's no one to blame for this particular problem? What then? How do I feel about the situation then? Or how could I help to resolve future instances of the same problem? These are, kind of more legitimate questions to be asking to help you feel better, to help you feel less to blame. Then, of course, ask yourself, how do I tend to personalize things, right? How do I do this? What are the ways in which I do this? Are there specific situations in which I do this? Do I tend to gain some value from it? Why do I think this way? What am I telling myself? What's the story I'm telling myself in these situations? The key objective, again, is awareness, becoming aware. It's also important to begin to distinguish the difference between self-criticism and self-correction, right? We're not looking to blame ourselves, to get feeling guilty about things, but instead to solve problems that are presented to us so that we can correct our unhelpful cognitions. So check in with the reality. How realistic is it for me to blame myself for this particular set of circumstances? Important questions to ask. I'm just going to check our time here. Good, we're on schedule, but halfway through. So next up, black and white thinking. Black and white thinking. So let's talk about that. We all know that person who does not see any shades of gray. This is the person who sees the world as all or nothing. Things are either good or bad, right or wrong. We only see things in extremes. There's no middle ground, no shades of gray, no in-betweens. This is super unhelpful, right? Because we know that in life, circumstances are never truly one way or another. And if we use this kind of thinking, we can never really be unbiased, right? And so in order to successfully work through this particular cognitive distortion, we need to get into the habit of challenging ourselves to take into account different viewpoints and other, and here's a hard one, interpretations of the situation, right? Because black and white tends to see, it's this or it's this. There's no interpretation. So we may have some very extreme expectations of ourselves. Never make mistakes when doing this thing. Yet when you do make a mistake, you then view yourself as a complete and utter failure because of the black and white thinking. Maybe you have a disagreement with a coworker And as a result, you decide that if you can't agree on the subject, that you cannot work together. That doesn't make sense, right? But this is that black and white thinking. These are these extremes of behavior. Thinking this way is so detrimental because it tends to make us feel inadequate or worthless if we don't meet the expectation that we've artificially established. The reality is that absolutes simply don't exist. However, if we tend to view the world in terms of absolutes, then we will likely always feel worthless because we simply can't live up to those lofty expectations, these exaggerated expectations that we have created for ourselves. So again, asking some very specific and pointed exploratory questions is helpful. How do I tend to indulge in black and white thinking? Where does that show up? In what specific kinds of situations do I tend to do this? Why do I think this way? What is the story I'm telling myself, right? How does indulging in black and white thinking make me feel? Ooh, that's a hard one, right? Do I gain something positive from it or negative? So again, the objective is to get an awareness of thinking about it, beginning to move into that change state. It's really important in this process to remind ourselves that nothing, absolutely nothing is 100% like this or like that. Nothing is 100% good, 100% bad, 100% black, 100% white. It's not all just about the winners and losers in life. There are many different levels, many different gradations. And these gradations enrich our lives. They give us so many incredible new opportunities. And it's so great, right? It's so great. So ask ourselves some questions to overcome the black and white thinking. Does this thinking tend to motivate me? Why? Does this black and white thinking motivate me or support me? Has there been a time in the past when things were not this way that I thought, but were rather another way? That there was a different interpretation that was actually correct? Where's the evidence that suggests that I'm right? Or what's the evidence that disproves my theory? What could be worse than this? What could be better? Would everyone else see things as this way? Because if black and white thinking truly is accurate, then everybody should see it as either this or this. Does this make sense? Does this make sense at all? So ask ourselves those challenging exploratory questions and those solution-focused questions. Oh, I went backwards, didn't I? Sorry. Catastrophizing. Oof, oh boy. That was one that I used to be super guilty of. Super engaged in. This is that cognitive distortion where we just make things so much bigger than they actually are. We blow things completely out of proportion. In other words, we make things bigger or worse than they are. The reality of our predicament often is actually very different. The problem that we face might in fact be quite insignificant, a minor mishap. Because we indulge in the habit of catastrophizing, though, it grows, it gets bigger. Excuse me. And then that makes them extremely difficult to overcome. So in order to work through this particular cognitive distortion, we have to ask ourselves, really question whether things are truly as bad as we make them out to be. So maybe I can't find my wallet, can't find it, and I immediately assume someone has stolen it and is now emptying out my bank accounts, has stolen my ID. I'm now the victim of identity theft. I'm not going to be able to do anything. I'm not going to be able to pay my bills. Because I can't pay my bills, I'm going to lose my car. I'm going to lose my house. And if I don't have a car, I can't go to work. And if I can't go to work, I'm going to lose my job. And if I lose my job, I'm going to lose, my home and my family. And whoa, 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 put the brakes on, Sally. This is catastrophic thinking at its finest, absolute finest, right? And when you're catastrophically thinking, you are creating the absolute worst case scenarios possible in your head out of things that may be small or insignificant. You may be creating problems where none exist. And what's worse, we're typically over exaggerating these problems in absolutely unrealistic ways. So some people catastrophize in order to feel important, to win the sympathy of other people, to add more excitement to their lives. ultimately the reasons for catastrophic thinking don't matter. They really don't. What matters is that it can lead to significant phantom problems in our lives, only real in our imaginations, and that slowly but surely take over our entire life, causing us no end of distress. They aren't real, but they feel real. And soon things become so overwhelming and we start to lose control. We start to just, lose the anchor altogether. So again, some exploratory questions. Ask ourselves, how do I tend to catastrophize things? Why? When do I tend to do this? With whom? What am I saying to myself? What is that story that I'm telling myself when I'm doing catastrophic thinking? The objective, again, is to gain awareness, understand why we do the thing. Question the things with some solution-focused questions. Am I blowing this out of proportion? Does worrying about this protect me? Does it prepare me? Is it necessary? Thinking realistically about this, how likely is it that it's going to happen? And what evidence is there to support these thoughts? What if things aren't as bad as I make them out to be? Then what? What if actually the opposite is more likely to happen? Ask yourself, how many times before have you made an incorrect prediction? What if this isn't a problem to begin with? What if it's only a phantom problem? Or what if my thoughts about this are true? Then what? What would specifically have to happen in order to make this a reality? And what are the actual realistic chances of this thing happening in the way in which I've catastrophized it? What positives could result from this scenario? Are there any opportunities here? And then ask yourself, how would others see things differently than how I have been imagining them? Again, we are challenging our thoughts, challenging the way in which we process things and the way in which we see the world, which is a really hard thing to do, but it's an important part of overcoming some of these unhelpful thinking styles. So next up is overgeneralization. And this is one where, we take a single piece of evidence, a single isolated incident, and then impose that experience on all current or future scenarios, right? In other words, if something happens to you once, then it will happen in every situation like that forever and ever, over and over again. So, nothing ever works for me. I'm doomed to fail. I never have any luck because maybe once you didn't get the job that you interviewed for. So this is a case of justifying the way you're feeling about the present based on some past particular incident, isolated incident. And this is maybe helpful if you're using this as a means of learning from past experiences. Oh, hey, this thing happened in the past. Similar circumstances coming up. I don't want to have that happen again. But if it's, oh, this happened in the past, therefore that means that it will happen in every single circumstance in the future. It is not a predictor. So it's problematic when we think about it that way. So some of the statements of overgeneralization would be things like, you always do this. Everyone's always like that. Things always end up like this for me, right? When we make these broad conclusions about how things will be in the present based on very little evidence from the past, it can leave us feeling like we have no control over our lives, like we are completely rudderless, that we have no choice, and we feel helpless, we feel disheartened, we feel like our decisions don't rest within us, that they have very little bearing. And that is just absolutely defeating. So again, we ask ourselves some exploratory questions. Think about it. How do I tend to overgeneralize things? Pardon me, when do I tend to do it? Why do I think this way? What do I tend to say to myself in these cases? How does it make me feel? Do I gain value? Again, the objective to gain that awareness and be tuned into yourself. Then ask yourself some more helpful solution-focused questions. And it's really important that we get out of the habit of building our entire future around isolated negative events or instances and avoiding words of absolutes such as always or never. So again, ask yourself, am I being realistic when I overgeneralize? What evidence do I have to support this? Just because someone has acted like this before, does this mean they will always act this way? How else could things be? What are the possibilities? What have I failed to consider? Would other people make the same generalizations that I'm making? Why? Why not? Right? So we're really challenging our thoughts. What if I overgeneralize things the opposite way? Instead of focusing on one negative, what if I focused on one positive and use this to predict future scenarios? What would happen then? So really, again, we're challenging our cognitions and reframing, reframing, reframing. Next up, labeling. So this is our tendency to make global statements, right? About ourselves, about our people around us, based on their behaviors in very specific situations. So a little bit like overgeneralizing, but not exactly. This is kind of the Post-it note, the sticker. So instead of describing the specific behavior and taking it in isolation, we choose to create labels that are absolute and negative. So it's not actually about the behavior in the moment. It's about making judgments about all future behavior based on what we've just observed. I can think of, as an external, you see a child having a 2-year-old having a tantrum, as 2-year-olds often do, and you say, well, that child is a brat. And then in every interaction you have with that child in the future, you're like, that child is a brat. When in fact, that child was hungry, tired, overwhelmed, overstimulated, and it was an isolated incident. Right? So you've labeled the child as a brat. You might say things to yourself such as, I'm such an idiot, instead of, I made a mistake. Or, that person is so unreliable, instead of, wow, they let me down today. Right? So it's knowing that we're not using kind language. Oh, he's such a jerk, instead of, you know what, he wasn't at his best today. So when we label ourselves, we are at that very moment creating a negative and very flawed self-image based on our personal errors. And let's be honest, there is no single human among us that is perfect, right? And so this self-image influences our self-esteem, and our self-esteem affects the choices and decisions that we make or fail to make. So when we label ourselves in limiting ways, in negative ways, based on only one thing, it can have a very significant impact on our lives. It's ultimately irrational, and we're not any one thing that we do. Our lives are an ever-changing flow of thoughts and emotions. We're not static, stationary creatures. We are constantly evolving and changing. But when we get into this mindset of, this is the only thing I am, we become stuck. We become fixed. And we start to live down to our expectations. We begin to believe the label we've given ourselves. So again, ask ourselves some exploratory questions. Is this label true? How do I tend to label myself? What are the names, the words that we use to label ourselves? How do I think at the time when I use that label? Stupid, irrational, unkind, etc., etc. How does thinking in this way ultimately make me feel? Why do I tend to make these sorts of labels? Right? Again, the objective being awareness. And to overcome, asking yourself those solution-focused questions. Am I labeling this specific behavior, or am I labeling the whole person? And how is this of significance? Right? What evidence is there that proves the label is correct? What evidence is there that disproves the label I just made? What other situations prove or disprove this label? And what is the opposite of the label that I'm making? How might the opposite be true? Would other people label me the same way? Why or why not? Right? Again, you're seeing a pattern in the exploratory questions and the solution-focused questions. There is a pattern in them of challenging the negative cognitions, the unhelpful thinking styles. So, getting into shoulding and musting. This is that cognitive distortion where we tend to make unrealistic, unreasonable, ridiculous demands on ourselves and on others. Okay, this is I should do this, you must do that. And I often will say, stop shoulding on yourself, right? When we use should statements or must statements, we are putting a great deal of external pressure on ourselves, undue pressure, and on other people to meet our high personal standards and our high expectations in specific situations. And this is unhelpful because it sets people up for failure. It sets people up to not do well, and it doesn't take into account any other alternatives, right? In order to successfully work through this particular cognitive distortion, we need to question whether things must be done a certain way. We need to consider the possibility that there's another way we haven't yet considered. Shoulding and musting, okay? So, you know, you can raise your hand or pop in the chat box. Do you should yourself? Do you must yourself? And I think that this is one that a lot of people get into. I should go for a run. I should eat healthier. I shouldn't watch so much Netflix. I must contact this person that I've, not been, yeah, there you go, right? That I've not been in contact with. It's important that we give ourselves permission to not should and must. So again, same thing, some exploratory questions around the shoulding and musting. We get to click there. How do you do this? Consider how you tend to use shoulding and musting. What are the ways in which this happens? When do I tend to do this? What unreasonable expectations do I put on people? How do I think I am at this time? What am I telling myself? What is the story? How does thinking in this way with the pressure of shoulding and musting make me feel? Why do I have these kinds of expectations? And your objective is to get that awareness, to begin to understand how we tend to use should and must. Be aware of that. Start to ask yourself those solution-focused questions. Does thinking this way motivate me, or is it demotivating? Right? Does being strict and demanding help motivate others? Is this the way it is, or do I actually have a choice? And I love to suggest that we change our language from should to choose. Right? When we eliminate should and add choose, it changes things. What if I choose to do something else? What then? What rule says I must do this? Like what is that external rule that says I must, right? If I use the words choose to or I prefer to, how does that change things? Why should I do this? Why must I do this? What if I didn't? What other options are there? These are great questions to be asking yourself regularly. Oops. Next up, emotional reasoning. Those are kind of two words that don't go together particularly well, right? Emotional reasoning. So this is making decisions. I am such a hand talker. This is making decisions based on how you feel rather than on objective reality, right? So you are therefore basing your view of the situation, of yourself or of others in ways that mirror your feelings at the time. So in other words, your current emotional state is influencing how you perceive a situation despite any evidence to the contrary. So maybe you're in a rotten mood, you're angry because you had a fight, and then everyone that you meet is painted in that filter, is seen through that filter of anger. This is where the emotional reasoning means that we automatically tend to believe that what we're feeling is the truth. However, in that moment, it is only true for you. It's only true for you as the individual. The feelings that someone else experiences might be very, very different. And it's these differences that determine how we perceive the situation. It determines what decisions we make. It determines what actions we ultimately make. For example, maybe you're feeling really guilty about something, which signifies, obviously, you may have done something wrong or hurtful. In another situation, you might be feeling overwhelmed and disheartened, which signifies that you're not capable of solving your problems. And this is how we filter things, right? When we're feeling a certain way, we assume that it means that our life is also that way, that matches that particular emotion that we're feeling. And we're allowing our emotional experiences to guide our choices. This hurts us because sometimes we may not feel like doing something, but we do it because of the negative emotion that we're experiencing. When we allow our emotions to dictate our behavior, then we tend to continually fall prey to limiting habitual patterns of thinking, right? If I'm feeling guilty and I interact with someone else, I assume that they're blaming me for something, right? And that's how that works. So let's think about then those exploratory questions as they relate to emotional reasoning. How do I tend to make decisions based on my feelings and my emotions? Do we do that? Right? And then how do we tend to predict the future using emotional reasoning? Or how do I tend to make judgments based on that? Why do I do this? When do I do this? In what kind of circumstances? What is the story I'm telling myself? Is this an indulgence? And why do I indulge this way? So again, asking yourself some more solution-focused questions. This is, am I basing my interpretation of this experience on the facts of the situation or on my emotion? That's a hard one, right? What are the facts actually? What specifically can I see and hear? And why is this important, right? The actual physical stuff. How are other people interpreting the information, and what evidence suggests that the way I'm thinking is not accurate? Are other people's interpretations based on feelings or on facts? And really, how accurate is it to use emotional reasoning to predict the future? Is it valuable to use emotional reasoning to make judgments about other things, about people, about myself? Given what I now know, have my emotions guided me well, or have they hurt me? Important questions to be asking yourself. Next up is magnification and minimization. We're almost through it. We're getting there. We've got about 8 or 9 minutes left and we're going to make it. This is number 10. So this is when we really discount, we ignore the positives. This unhelpful thinking style either magnifies the positive attributes of other people at the same time that it minimizes our own positive attributes. In other words, we are exaggerating the negatives about us, while our weaknesses, while at the same time maximizing others and understating our own positives, right? So instead of saying, oh, hey, excuse me, pardon me, someone gives you a compliment and you say, wow, thank you very much. And say, well, it was nothing. And then in your head, you're like, well, they don't really mean it. Oh, they're just being nice. Oh yeah, no, I wouldn't be able to do that again. I just got lucky. Thanks though. This is minimizing your positive attributes and maximizing the negative. And this isn't, really about ignoring positive experiences or attributes, but really about turning the positives into negatives because your state of mind is in that limiting place. So this is that inability to accept anything positive in your life. Instead, you'll go out of your way to turn it into something negative and unhelpful. The more we dwell on the negatives, the less we're able to appreciate the really good things in our lives. And of course, there's nothing wrong with being humble, right? Like, let's thank you. Please, that's awesome. I love that. However, it's not healthy if you're constantly turning your own positive experiences into something negative, constantly devaluing your positives, putting yourself down, completely disqualifying your own attributes isn't healthy. And it, again, can significantly affect your self-esteem in the long run. And continued poor self-esteem leads to those feelings of inadequacy, which eventually can lead down the path to depression. Self-deprecating is not healthy in this context. So again, challenge yourself with some exploratory questions. How do I tend to magnify the positive attributes of others? And how do I tend to minimize the positive attributes of myself? How do I twist my positive experiences and attributes in a negative way? How am I thinking at the time? Why do I think this way? When, in what kind of circumstances do I tend to indulge in this negative thinking, in this magnification and minimizing thinking style? Again, we're just gaining awareness at this point and asking some more solution-focused questions. Why do I feel that it's so important to minimize the positives? Why specifically do I perhaps do this? What are the consequences of this way of thinking about things? What assumptions am I making about myself, about others, or about the situation when I do this? How are my assumptions preventing me from seeing the truth? How is this hurting me? How could it be of value to magnify the positives of a situation? How would that make me feel? What if the other person actually did mean what they say? What if they actually did mean that compliment? What evidence is there that supports that this is true? What if I deserve to be complimented? What if I deserve the results that I attained? What if it wasn't just luck, but a combination of knowledge and experience and skills and talent? What's the evidence for that? What if you believed that you were truly capable and deserving? How would that change things? Would other people discount you in this way? These are some really important questions to ask. We need to remember that everything begins with a thought. How we think and how we interpret the world around us influences how we feel. And how we feel stirs up our emotions. We then use these emotions as a filter that helps us interpret our life experiences. These interpretations are completely varied. They are often not very accurate. In fact, they can prevent us from seeing the world as it is, to perceive the world based on how we are. And of course, how we are depends entirely on how we process the world. So it's really interconnected when we create these filters. How we view and process the world begins with the thoughts that we allow ourselves to experience, the ones that we allow ourselves to dwell upon. So if we can take charge of those thoughts by working through those 10 cognitive distortions, then we'll be better poised to take charge of our life, to take charge of our anxiety. So here's the homework. I want you to think about what triggers your thought patterns, what triggers those unhelpful thinking styles for you. So here's some prompts for you. I felt excluded. I felt powerless. I felt unheard. I felt scolded. I felt judged. I felt blamed. I felt disrespected. I felt a lack of affection. I felt I couldn't speak up. I felt lonely. I felt ignored. I felt I couldn't be honest. I felt like the bad guy. I felt forgotten. I felt unsafe. I felt unloved. I felt like it was unfair. I felt frustrated. I felt disconnected. I felt trapped. I felt a lack of passion. I felt uncared for. I felt manipulated, or I felt controlled. These are some prompts to help you understand what triggers or what activates those responses, those unhelpful thinking styles for you. So here's the list of suggested triggers, and here's the homework. Over the next week, pay attention to any triggers for anxiety that you may experience. Use your journal, your notebook, a Post-it note, your phone, the notes in your phone. Write them down in each of the following categories. Emotions, okay? So emotional triggers, mental images, physical states, how you're feeling in your body, thoughts that you've had, perhaps the presence of another person, maybe some social pressures. It could be the physical setting, like where you are actually located. Perhaps activities that you're engaged in create that trigger effect for triggering the anxiety and those unhelpful thinking styles. And you could have a category of other, because everyone is unique and they may experience it differently. This is a great way to start to understand what activates your anxiety and what activates those unhelpful thinking styles for you. So we have reached 1:30, which is amazing. I'm wondering if there are any questions that folks might have. So I see there's some Q&A popping up. Okay. Oops, sorry, I popped the questions. I can hear my mom using should, must. Okay, wow. So you've got that internal voice in there, for sure, for sure. Okay, any other questions? Okay. Let's see, what do we got here? Oh, thank you, Angela. Thank you. You're a stinking thinker. Okay, yeah. Well, a lot of us engage in that stinking thinking, right? And it's definitely important to challenge that stinking thinking. I love that you use that term. I use that turn of phrase when I work with young people. So thank you for sharing that. Other questions? Anyone? Anyone have any questions? As always, you can reach me via all the socials if you have any questions. Always open to, to having a question, having a chat. Love that you've all been here. Hope that this is helping to build your toolbox, helping you to understand your anxiety a little bit more and how it manifests and in the ways in which it manifests. If there are no further questions, we'll wrap up for this week. We'll see you next week, next Friday, May 29th at 12:30 p.m. Atlantic. We will be wrapping up our anxiety toolbox. Oh, another question coming in. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Yona. And if you want to review the homework, you can always review the video. These will be posted to the CMHA of New Brunswick YouTube channel, so you can subscribe there. And there's lots of great webinars that have been going on for the last 9 to 10 weeks, all available for reviewing. Lots of great topics, and always exciting to share the information with each other. So thank you all for attending. Hope to see you next week. I hope you, I'm just looking out here, it's looking just absolutely gorgeous outside, so I hope you enjoy a beautiful weekend, and I will see you all next Friday, 12:30 p.m. Atlantic. Take care.